more about that?
Well, yeah, so I was not advocating physical Swedish gymnastics. I'm not saying we should reintroduce Swedish gymnastics tomorrow for the school system. But it can be a source of inspiration in the sense that this was a practice that was concerned with the body alone. It was movement for the sake of movement. In that sense, it was a typical school subject. And you could say in school we do mathematics for mathematics' sake. Of course, we do mathematics in order to become an engineer, but in a sense that doesn't matter. In school we do history for history's sake, and perhaps Swedish gymnastics was physical education for movement's sake.
But we do mathematics and history much less for mathematics and history's sake than we used to.
Yeah.
I mean, all of that.
Yeah, but it's all changed. It's the same. You see the same tendencies.
Yeah.
And the second thing is that you can't perform Swedish gymnastics alone. It's typically a group activity. So this communizing dimension is it's very important for defining what Swedish gymnastics is about, and that might also be a source of inspiration.
Why can you not do it for fun? Because I think you can. Because I think all those videos in the 70s where you did your fitness training to your Jane Fonda training, you put the DVD in. It's just that DVDs and VHS didn't exist then. You could do Swedish gymnastics completely by yourself in your bedroom.
Yeah, I'm not saying that you can perform these movements or sets of movements. Of course you can do that, but then I think there's a different experience. I think that part of the experience is that everybody does the same at the same time.
It's every able body though.
It exists.
But it's every. I mean, I guess my.
Just discovered my weak point.
Yeah, but it's every able body, and I guess what I feel the work that some of the people here do that can contribute to your argument and extend it is that I think when a lot of our work's to do with stillness and to do with shared experiences which aren't necessarily visible or audible, but shared experiences that are palpable and discernible. You're not intending them, but you can tune into. So I might be teaching a Skinner releasing technique, say, and there might be a moment where everybody's lying on the floor, and they've been led through a checklist of awareness, so they're in a sort of heightened sense of awareness. But rather than using that sense of awareness to make them more efficient and do something better, you might use affect by introducing an image. So people are just tapping into an experience of an image, and what I'm aware of when I'm teaching in that context is I'm standing outside that as a witness, but there's a shared experience that the participants aren't necessarily consciously aware of, but there's a shared experience of breath, the heartbeat slowing down, actual physical transformation of musculature, the way it's hanging along the bones, space in the joints. So there's physically that the mass of the body, the structure of the body changes. People aren't necessarily consciously aware that that's happening and that that's happening in the shared experience, and everybody's experience of it's part of their experience. But it's kind of like the image of breath against voice. We're critiquing the way that voice is used as an image in political discourse. And I would agree with your critique of voice. I think, underneath voice is breath, and it moves on its own. And it's not an expression of intention. So I kind of think, for me, what's interesting about this moment is that I think there's a dimension of our practices that doesn't dispute, but that could possibly extend your arguments. But at the same time, a lot of our discourses are caught up in some of the discourses that you critique, primarily discourses of increased choice and intentionality and the body's knowingness, which is, one dimension of things, but it does still instrumentalize the body. So I'm kind of interested in that place where some of the work that we do and the work that you're doing meets. I kind of feel that would be a really interesting political place. That would be a really interesting political power, because then when you're in the situation of multitude that you were describing, and all those bodies are together, there's a rhythm that's happening there that you can tap into without having to make some visible display, without needing a room for you to have some kind of drill, without having there's something palpable. Last night we were talking about atmosphere, so it's maybe also to do with that. But I'm just interested in how you tap into. I don't mean a shared rhythm of breath and that everybody's going with that insane rhythm, but that there's a synchronicity of the rhythms of everybody's individual breath. There's a writer called George Leonard, who's a neuroscientist. His deal is that if you think of the body as solid, so you look at a bone, and then you notice that it's porous, so you get kind of microscope and you look at the bits that are solid around the porous bits, and they're porous, so you get a bigger microscope and you look at the bits that are solid around those porous bits, and they're porous, so you get a really big microscope and you look at the bits that's porous around those bits, porous, and they're still porous, and eventually you have to get a particle accelerator, because all there is rhythm, and essentially the mass of the body is essentially about rhythm, which you so beautifully brought out at the end of your talk. So there's something about, his deal is there's a rhythm that each person has an aspect of rhythm that's unique to them, but an aspect of rhythm that connects, he says, to the rhythm of expanding universe. That goes along with some kind of quantum physics that I don't understand. But that idea of there being the possibility of tapping into a dimension of shared rhythm without necessarily display. I think that's kind of real political power in that.
Can I respond to
Yes.
this? Because maybe it's because the last image that was on the slide was of Tahrir Square, I assume, or also because you introduced the terminology of multitude, which somehow stands in a Marxist tradition of political agency. I think this idea of display, with thinking at least within a political collectivity, is still totally required, because just being in this kind of introspective being together in a studio is a togetherness for sure, but I don't I couldn't see how this can, without a public display, produce a certain political force. I can see how this sharing of a rhythm produces a being together and an experience of being together, but within the choice of the picture and the last word, I read also this direction of what does that mean to a political agency. There, I think a public display is somehow the minimum requirement for a being together to become political.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I guess I'm kind of interested in the place where private and public, rather than the divide between private and public. I guess I'm interested in the place where they meet.
So, through today, in relation to what's happening here, I keep bumping up the edges of, I think I've written it downstairs, I've said it to a few people, so if I articulate it worse than I articulate it to them, they can chip in. I keep bumping up against, in this experience of we, or together, this kind of reclaiming or redefining of a building through, so in this, across these 3 days, and particularly today, I've been noticing that the we-ness of the group living and existing and thinking and on some questions around this, these propositions that you know that this festival is about. I've been noticing that the I of me, the I-ness, kind of gets it gets softened in a way, if you like, or the tone comes down in it because of the we of the group, and then in this encounter of the edges, so in this encounter of people entering or being part of the public, if you like, the people coming in, or the talks happening in the places that we're sleeping in, the softening of the self or the I-ness in that is then kind of becomes sort of hyper real. So in this thing that you've been talking about, which is this idea of the multitude or the group, making visible patterns which might have a potential for change. This is just like I'm sweating, but my experience is this: that I soften self to become part of a group. I was thinking of Swedish gymnastics and groups, and in becoming kind of woven in that group or in that we in a way that I don't normally experience, I become the I-ness or the self becomes redefined in some kind of, like I feel like I've taken on a slightly different shape in that. And then I was thinking about repetition in relation to that, and we haven't been doing any sort of demonstrative, we haven't been choreographing anything or producing anything or kind of doing anything. Well, we have, but not in that the way that you so aptly demonstrated by getting out of your chair. But then I was thinking about what are the patterns that we are repeating as a group that make this residency possible and that make my survival in it possible. And is it those patterns of repetition that offer me a way to think about this multitude in a more political sense, and how long would I need to stay in those patterns or in those redefinitions of us and I as part of the same thing? Like, if the me and the we become less separate, then how long would I need to stay attending to those patterns in order to facilitate what it is that I think you're talking about in relation to the shift that doesn't just happen in the studio, it kind of spreads outwards.
So the question is how long? How long will this take?
2 weeks, 3 days, and 3 hours.
It's like, I mean, can you help me out here?
The softer one happens effectively as a continuous thing, and then the demonstrative one can happen as an event and be significant. But the softer in studio leaking, gathering one, bubbling away, that feels like something continuous to me. But that's my experience of it.
Is this a good moment for you to expand a little bit on this, the point that you skipped, the connection between self-loss and Agamben's potentiality, because there is something that maybe the link.
So what Agamben says that his own philosophy is only about one thing, namely to understand what it means that we as human beings can say of ourselves, I can. We are not creatures of necessity or creatures of possibility. What does that mean? And of course we might point to all kinds of things that we can do. So we go to the body, that would mean, okay, I can dance or I can run 100 meters in 15 seconds, whatever. What Agamben would claim is that when we experience these successful acts, we don't experience that we can dance, or that we can run, that we can do whatever. This is actually very difficult to express in English. Things that that's you can express this in Italian way easier than in English, but you can have an experience. That's what Agamben claims, that you can. It doesn't work so well in English, but experience that you can at the very moment that you cannot. That's what he claims. Potentiality, in its deepest, most profound sense, is impotentiality, lack of potentiality. So it is at the moment that your subjective, individual ambitions come to a stop, that you might really experience what it means that you can. We'll give two examples. He gave the example of, well, just suppose that we turn all the lights out and that we are in complete darkness. That might be a moment when we realize that we can see. Or the other example I gave this afternoon, repeat a word again and again and again and again and again until it stops signifying, and you're confronted with what he calls the materiality of language, the pure sign. Confrontation with the pure sign makes you experience that you can do something with words. And I would say, so this is a thing I did not explore, that in Swedish gymnastics, but and by extension in other forms of movement education, this experience of I can is at stake. Precisely by putting an end to wanting to express myself in movement and just repeating the most basic movements, I might have a very strong experience that I can move, what it means to be a moving being. In that sense, it's a strong experience of potentiality. I'm not sure because I see that you.
I didn't get the analogy with the gymnastics because you're speaking about the point where I do not or I can not, which makes me aware of what I can. So how does that? I'm not sure.
With the word, the repetition of the word.
Well, is this like a thing about like a Foucauldian thing? Like we are both victim and agents within the system, within this kind of power system of this institutional, technical, physical thing, like gymnastics?
But I would say that Agamben's ambition is to set a step further than Foucault, in the sense that for Foucault there is no way out. We are always, by definition, the victim of power structures, which at the same time,
we're
like you
also
say,
agents.
which at the same time make us agents. That Agamben draws attention to a kind of experience that, even if it's only momentarily, abolishes any power structure. That we are, in a literal sense, beyond power. But beyond power in the sense that, for instance, in Nietzsche, beyond good and evil doesn't mean that we are immoral, that we start to behave like a bastard or whatever, but that we have an experience of life that is no longer susceptible to be described in terms of either good or evil. So that there might be an experience, again, even momentarily, where life is experienced as such that it is not susceptible for structuring by any societal regime. I know that many people, precisely for this reason, say that Agamben is a very naive, anarchist thinker who has But I really think that if you look at certain practices, I can give again the example of a fit of communal laughter, that there is a lot of truth in that. I know, of course, after the laughter, we have to continue, and then again we are in a world that is structured according to power relations, but that doesn't mean that there might be power, that there might be moments of, I don't know whether I should call them suspension or interruption, but they can make a difference. I gave the example of the judge and the accused laughing together. I'm sure it never happens. Juridical apparatus is yeah. But for instance, a parent and a child that laugh together, that might change their relationship for good. If I can become autobiographical, one of the most strong experience I had when I was a student in secondary school, it didn't have to do with laughing but with crying. We had a history teacher. Actually, it was the same history teacher my father had. We went to the same school. So he had been working in the same school for, I don't know, 30, 40 years. And even at the time that my father went to that school, the teacher was, do you say that, bullied by the students? He was the, do you say that, the laughing stock, yeah. So, and when I attended his class, it was the last year that he worked there, and I remember it in the flesh, so to speak. So he was talking about Renaissance and Baroque, and he brought books to well, it was the time that PowerPoint didn't. I'm really old, you know. there were no computers then. So the teachers still had to bring books, hard books with illustrations of Michelangelo and so on. So he really did his best to, he really carried a lot of books, and so he was explaining what he had to explain, and then suddenly someone throws something at him. And at that moment, this must have been the frustration of more than 40 years. This guy, so he was 60 years old, he started to cry like a baby. This changed, this moment really changed everything. And when I meet today people who were with me in the classroom that day, the first thing we relate to is that event. It was such a powerful event. The teacher starting to cry. This, I would say, is a moment that, okay, it is only a moment, but it really made, it was a moment of transformation. And I know that the last weeks that this teacher taught at that school, he...
This is also, in this example, and also in the example of the courtroom, there's a certain hierarchy involved. I was thinking about this example of the courtroom, and yes, you're probably right. The example of the courtroom and the judge and the defendant laughing together. I presume, yeah, you're right that it doesn't happen. And I guess there are two. Yeah, maybe it does. I mean, I guess if it doesn't happen so often, there are two explanations. Either you invoke some kind of idea that sociologically or kind of with these techniques of power, that's never permitted to happen through some ordering of the elements that are there, or there's some embodied social rule which does not allow the judge to laugh. He's in a kind of a space within himself. He will not laugh at anything, even if otherwise he would find it funny. Interestingly, I think that if the judge started to laugh and then the defendant caught the compulsive laughter, there would not be as much of a problem with this as the other way. And the same in this classroom. If the child started to cry, you would not have the same explosion of grief because he's in a lower position than the teacher. The teacher crying allows everybody to be part of this, but the other way around does not happen. And that's why I think the laughter example is quite, I mean, I haven't read your laughter research, so I don't know, but the laughter example is quite a difficult one. And in your talk, I found it the more problematic, uncontrolled bodily response. I can see the argument in regards to sweating and defecation and sexual desires, but it seems to me that laughter is such a socially constructed response that it's difficult to apply an uncontrolled paradigm.
It's totally not socially structured. If I start laughing and you don't know why I'm laughing, what I'm laughing about, you can also start laughing. You don't need to share anything. Sorry?
Well, you can also not start.
Try. I've been in various forced situations in drama-based classes where it's about a group starting to laugh. And
it's very difficult.
But that's not real laughing, is it? That's not real laughing.
But that some people are actually laughing in that situation.
But I can imagine in that situation seems to be very, very different.
But I think the issue isn't inevitability that everyone will join in. I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the hierarchy. I think that's very, very specific conditions. But if laughter were to begin in this circle for any reason, it's possible that not everyone would join it. But it's also probable that it's possible there would be a degree of contagion. And so it may not. I think the issue is not one person laughs and everyone joins in, but that there's some degree of contamination between our bodies.
But the point of that being uncontrollable is a different one, because if everybody starts laughing, then it's hard to sort of isolate, whether there's a moment where you allow yourself to have that contagion.
Yes,
in
there
order
are conditions
that you won't
in which
be left out.
There are conditions in which you would be affected differently by it.
Or, I'm sort of talking about the kind of, whether there's a pre-conscious level to, a conscious level to love.
Yeah, I wonder whether, I see what you mean, you could stop, you could consciously just decide, God, I'm not going to laugh. But the physical, would your point be that the physical initiation of laughter would still be there, even if your body would have responded, even if you disallow the way you might try not to fart in public. It's the same.
Allowing what you're speaking about, but I don't know if many people have not found themselves in a situation where they laugh by accident, and then probably find that it's quite inappropriate. And in that instance, there isn't this space that's allowed for one to make that decision. So then it's based upon and for want of better words, also how open one is, either with their body or their flesh, to come back to this, to be able to take on what's referred to as this contagion or this participation, which is why I was interested that in one part of your talk you actually used the word communization as well, and which was also something I was thinking about when Katie spoke, and about repetition and rhythm. And to me, within the residency space, maybe it's on a very obvious level, but the thing that everyone is repeating is waking and sleeping and eating and doing these things in the space, and to a level of coordination where they are sort of waking together, sort of sleeping. And this is another type of pattern. It may not be a gymnastic pattern, it may not be absolutely in tune on the breath, but they're also inhabiting the same space, they're subject to the same type of daylight. There are lots of conditions available that are creating potential kind of collective behaviour in rhythm. But as to whether one partakes in something, makes a choice or not, or allows, it's something about the openness, I would call it, of being open to that bit, being open to go without not having that.
But there's I don't think it's translated in English, but so you already referred to the famous courses of Michel Foucault at Paris. Before him, his chair was occupied by Roland Barthes, and he has a series of lectures, Comment vivre ensemble, how to live together. actually living these past days in a monastery, or at least in monastery conditions, and that this is never thought about that. That this is a precondition for true community to take place. That you do together the most banal and most basic things. I also think that this is part of what it means to be to form a family. We all have very romantic conceptions about a family and about parents loving their children and vice versa. But perhaps the core business of a family is just that you live together in this very basic way. You eat together, you sleep together, and so on. That this is really important, a really important communizing factor.
Sorry, I'm going to switch slightly. Certain words are, and I just want to bring this in, and I guess I don't know why I want to bring what's coming up is around this autonomous body, and around pain, and around agency, and collectivity. And there's a place for me where a lot of this gets played out, and that is in a BDSM scene context. And just wondered how that's. What you think about that?
What's BDSM?
Bondage, discipline,
One more time.
BDSM. It's bondage, discipline, sadomasochism.
Ah, okay.
It's pretty much.
Well, I think it's not. Continue because you talked about the guy that it's no coincidence that Foucault practiced. Oh, you didn't know?
No, I don't know much about it.
Ah, okay, yeah.
I'm just putting things in here.
But perhaps there are people that are more qualified to answer that question.
But the flesh and the autonomous and how much agency we have in that collective being in the world, really. I'm just kind of curious about the places where we actually gain power out of some of this muckiness.
I was also always fascinated by Sartre's analysis of sadomasochism. So his starting point is, I don't understand why people do that. Why would you intentionally look for pain and the loss of control? And in the end he says, well, but this is because in the end the masochist is the super sadist, because he gains control again by completely defiling oneself. One gains control again. It's like the example Sartre uses is most criminals end up going to a bar, getting drunk and confessing their sins at the bar. So they can't live with the guilt, and just by saying, look how terrible person I am, they again win freedom. And perhaps you could explain masochism even in that way, in the sense that you, but that's Sartre's point of view, that you really, you want to be so humiliated, to suffer so much that you regain again a form of autonomy. But I don't know whether or not that works.
But also, exploring in his latest movie. Lars von Trier. In his latest movie, he's talking. He has that little subject, which is like, it brings the character back to the fact that she actually can live an orgasm again, which she lost, and via SM she reaches that level again.
But the submissive person in BDSM is really the person in control. Also,
Yes.
they have the safe word. You know, the moment they say stop, it stops. So the extent to which they go is always actually in the hands of the person that receives. So it's very much this. And going to this question of like, where are these spaces? I also understand this talk in a way that there will always be certain spaces where certain bodily functions and experiences are kind of almost in an experiment kind of environment set up, because I think BDSM is very much also that, experiencing your body as an object, giving up your subjecthood to a certain extent, and then regaining it in the final moment. But for example, to come back to kind of these moments of public protest, sudden eruptions of protest, there's this moment, I feel, where these bodily functions come up outside of this control, actually, where they are really outside. They're not within an environment that is safe ultimately, but these are moments where you might throw your body against a force that might actually lead to the destruction of you. So I think there's always going to be plenty of spaces within society, some more accepted publicly and some less, that you do in the back room somewhere in a BDSM club. But then there's also these moments where we really do lose control, and where suddenly being a body in space has an explosive potential.
Sadomasochism is practiced every day in culture all the time, in working, in dominant and submissive roles. People willingly give themselves up, or people willingly take control of other people. So it's everywhere all the time. So I'm not sure if people have any control over bodies.
The last thing I didn't catch.
Because of the mind, perhaps.
Okay. Can you speak on?
I'm not really sure, but something to do with the way that we naturally fall into roles in society, and the way that BDSM is only a sexual limb of something that is quite sociologically implicit in life. Everyone has a role at some point, and it always changes, and we don't necessarily have control of it because of other factors. I'm quite interested in what you were saying about the courtroom thing, because of my experience. I was on a jury, and we had a fairly amusing-ish case of kind of a sexual exposure. Someone had displayed themselves sexually in public, and the way that it was being told in such a mundane way was hilarious. And everyone had to laugh, and everyone for that moment broke the spell of whatever hierarchy they were in, and then they had to recollect themselves and put themselves back into position. It was brilliant.
And did it make a difference as regards your
verdict? Because then it completely skewed the jury, because we just treated it as a comedic venture rather than a disorder. That's the legal system.
That's why we can get people on stage.
So is this gymnastic form like ballet? Is it like a heavy thing?
It's very far-reaching, isn't it?
Is it? I don't know. Is it like that? Because, we could look at ballet as an SM practice,
Oh, it totally is.
I think that's what everybody might.
It's quite self-indulgent, in that way.
What? Swedish gymnastics?
No, ballet.
Self-indulgent?
It's quite...
Is the difference that ballet would aspire to have, that it has an aesthetic purpose in Swedish? That it has an aesthetic value. The ballet would position itself as having an aesthetic value, and an ultimate end, being the ballerina with this artistic.
The ultimate aim is the goal of agency, isn't it? But to get that, you have to suffer. So.
But there is an aesthetic dimension to it, which in Swedish gymnastics, presumably they're not pretending
But are there
there is.
competitions in Swedish gymnastics? In which case, were there competitions in Swedish gymnastics?
No. So
No.
It's a very interesting case. And so at the beginning of the Olympic movement, you had Swedish gymnastics and German, you will know it, turnen, met turnvater gaan. No, but turnen. Yeah, that's. But I don't know how I could translate that in English.
But gymnastics.
Yeah, but it's the wrong translation actually, because it was opposed to Swedish gymnastics. But turnen became one of the Olympic disciplines because you can excel in it. I know it's called gymnastics, but actually it has nothing to do with Swedish gymnastics. So some try to make it into Olympic discipline, but to a discipline at all. It didn't work, and I think it is because there is no aim. You can't excel in it. The only way to get better means that you become part of the group. That's all.
Right. I mean, that's very different. I mean, I guess of course Swedish gymnastics could be instrumentalized to be it burns this many calories a half hour and it improves your musculature.
Yeah,
blah blah blah.
But so from the very beginning, they have tried to give it another meaning than pure movement. So one of the things that people believed was that by doing these exercises, I told you, you would extend the volume of your chest.
I must improve.
Yeah.
I must.
Medically spoken, it's nonsense. But, and it also has been used as a preparation for warfare. So there are all kinds of very interesting sociological analyses. So some countries adopted the Turkish system, other countries adopted the Swedish gymnastics. There were typically countries that were in need of a big army that incorporated the Swedish gymnastics because they needed troops, whilst turnen is more an apt activity when you want to organize guerrilla warfare. As individual, you have to jump, you know. So
I'm wondering, how is that different than yoga or martial art? Because that's also war kind of training.
Yeah, but I would say I'm not an expert in Eastern traditions, but I'm sure that you find the same there, that a lot of very similar exercises have received or got a military orientation and are known today as martial arts, but
But I was wondering if there is something innate in the concept of repetition that we learn by walking, by standing up, falling, standing up, falling, standing up, falling. We learn how to speak by repeating the same word over and over again. And there's like something that happened this afternoon is like when we met and then we started shaking and then from shaking it became something else and then we started to play with the balloon and when like words were, all sounds were repeating just as a form of recognition. So I was wondering also like how repetition can be interpreted in so many different ways by going into repeating because someone else said to repeat until you die and then you have to repeat whether it's ballet, whether it's gymnastic or whether it's something that has to do with an imposed rhythm that has to be achieved and so that there is like something that has to be achieved or whether through rituals or repetition or circles or learning, repetition is essential in order to grow. So I think also the word like repetition in movement is not necessarily needs to be interpreted with a negative connotation, but it has a potential for different things. And then I think it depends if that understanding is shared of why we're repeating something, why we're doing it. Is it imposed?
I'm also interested in the fact that ballet has a body, or a corps de ballet, and how that might relate to an idea of cumulative movement or a multitude of movements moving in the same way. And then in some classical ballet, how the same movement in the same time can become one movement.
That's quite imposed. I mean, your leg needs to be at that height, and if it goes below that thing, someone will tell you off, and you have to get to that line.
So.
But then the experience potentially of being within that, and it absolutely is imposed in the framework that you're tied into, that is ultimately you could look at as incredibly repressive, but also is there something in that moment of being within that incredibly tight structure? I play music, and I know that when I'm playing with an orchestra, I have a very different feeling than when I play as a soloist. And I enjoy the feeling of playing with an orchestra.
It's like one sound, or you hear like one voice. It's not something to be proud of, if you can be heard in the choir.
I think it connects to what you were saying about loss of self, though. There's that thing in the orchestra, and what Katie was saying earlier, where you're part of this bigger thing. It's not actually about you and your perfect little violin playing, although you've got to play the violin perfectly. That perfect violin playing is oriented towards this thing which is beyond you, which I think ties into what you were talking about. And so there's a dimension of that loss of self that you talked
like
about that happens in the spontaneous practice.
It feels more like motivation and discipline when you have others around you that are also striving, that can draw out a motivation in you, perhaps competitiveness.
I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I don't know. I wasn't thinking about. I was thinking there's something that's big. There's a sum that's more than its parts in an orchestra. And there's a great on YouTube. There's this footage of Stravinsky, his last time he conducted. So he's like about 80 years old, and he's conducting Firebird, and to the London Philharmonia. And he has to totter up to the podium because he's really quite old and frail. And then he's on the podium, and he does some of it, the conducting's with his arms, but some of it's almost with his eyebrows. And there's no way the second violinist at the back can. So then I suddenly realised they're not following him. He's literally conducting that orchestra. That his body is a conductor for this thing. He's holding this, not by them following him, but by his presence in it. He's kind of holding it, and it just was the most extraordinary thing, and it kind of made me think of what you were saying, that it wasn't quite the same as motivation. It's that there was this thing that you were alluding to, which is only happens because I'm part of this other thing, which is kind of like the Pilates's different, or the gymnastics is different if I'm doing it on my own, multitude thing. And which I was trying to get at when I'm saying, that can happen in a studio where nobody's moving at all. And there's no demonstration of movement, but people's actually their cellular structures different. So I kind of think those things. I think your work really touches on those things in an indirect way. But we need to finish because they need to go to bed. But very soon.
Because we need to drink alcohol.
I didn't know if yours was concluding remarks.
Well, I really enjoyed.
So concluding remarks. We'll just have a moment. I'm
not going to make a conclusion. I just want to say I was a bit afraid before coming here because I had to talk with dancers. Me being no dancer at all, but that nevertheless we had a very interesting and stimulating discussion, and I learned about your remarks. So thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me.